Good evening, 3B, or should I say, almost fourth graders. It's time for tonight's story, A Dog's Porpoise. Gradually, the hubbub in the cafe was becoming a hush as they, too, realized what was expected of them, but nobody was brave enough to do it. It wasn't that nobody liked the art. The art was amazing. There was no denying it. The problem was, nobody wanted to be the first to endorse the controversial dog and porpoise that the whole gallery revolved around. And then something terrible happened. Those moments where, without any planning, the hush in a room became a total silence as everyone stopped talking at once. They stared at one another. They stared at the art. Natalie stared at the floor, praying that something would happen. And then a voice rang out in the silence. "How much for the charcoal porpoise?" Everyone turned. There, standing in a suddenly very empty patch of the gallery, was a beautiful woman with wavy blonde hair and a defined jaw that she stuck out defiantly. It was Natalie's mother. $300, Nancy Jane said, but for you, $250. Natalie's mother shook her head. "I'll pay full price." From across the room, the mayor raised his hand. "And I'd like to purchase the exquisite oil painting of Perkins Cove." Everyone turned to stare at him as well, and he went bright red again. "I think it's a beautiful representation of our little town," he said defensively. And after that, the ice was officially broken. Nancy Jane had just enough time to offer one amused wink to Natalie before she disappeared into a throng of people, asking about prices and picture frames. As Natalie was pushed to the back of the fray, she saw Mrs. Reardon pulling her husband to the front and telling him, "Wouldn't that photograph of the two of them be perfect above Sam's bed?" Natalie wanted to take a moment to celebrate Nancy Jane's success, but there was something else she had to do. She turned around and scanned the room, quickly locating the person she was looking for. This time, it was Natalie's turn to tap her mother on the shoulder. Her mother had been calmly studying the charcoal drawing she just bought, but upon turning and seeing Natalie, her eyes lit up with warmth and just a little bit of trepidation. "Hey," Natalie said, trying to get the words out quickly before she could change her mind. "Thank you for doing that, for supporting Nancy Jane, and me." Her mother looked like she wanted to hug Natalie, but Natalie took a step back. Still, when she spoke, Natalie could hear the hug in her mother's voice. "It was my pleasure," she said. "I miss seeing Nancy Jane every day." She smiled sadly. "And she's not the only person I miss." "Yeah, well..." Natalie's first instinct was to say something mean, but she looked at the charcoal drawing of Bangor speeding through the water, and then she looked back at her mother. "How..." Natalie gulped, and then continued, "How is Diver Bob doing?" Her mother's smile went from bittersweet to totally genuine. It was the first time Natalie had ever asked about her mother's new relationship. "You can just call him Bob," she said. "And he's good. Thank you for asking." She paused, searching for the right words. "He's more than good. He makes me laugh." Natalie gulped. "That's good," she said. "I can see how that would be good." Natalie's mother gazed down at her, and when she next spoke, her voice was low and earnest. "It wasn't about leaving your father behind, Natalie," she said. "He's still a very good man. It was about going where I needed to be. For me, I needed to be with someone who made me laugh. And don't be mad at your father either. Sometimes letting go of someone isn't giving up, it's helping." This was officially too much for Natalie. "Well, anyway," Natalie said, "just thought I'd say hi, and thanks for buying the drawing." "Of course," her mother said. "It's beautiful. It'll be good to have something to remember Bangor by." "What?" Natalie froze, her foot in the middle of a backward step. "What does that mean?" Natalie's mother blinked in confusion, and her mouth opened in a round O. Did your father not tell you?" she asked. "I thought..." "Tell me what?" Natalie's voice came out all scratchy. Her throat had suddenly gone very dry. Natalie's mother looked both ways and then closed the distance between her and her daughter, speaking in a quiet voice. Bob did some research on harbor porpoises, Natalie. They have to live in water that's below 60 degrees, and the water's getting warmer down here. Quickly, too quickly. Banger will have to go north soon, for his own good. He needs to be in his own habitat. Natalie felt like the room was spinning. In all the reading and research she had done on harbor porpoises, she hadn't come across this information. How had she missed this? "I told your father," her mother said. "I really thought he told you. Natalie, I'm sorry." Natalie turned and looked wildly around the gallery until she saw her dad, halfway to popping a cube of cheese in his mouth. When he saw the expression on his daughter's face, he froze. For the second time in an hour, Natalie pushed her way through a crowd, but this time she didn't bother with "excuse me." This time she yelled, "How could you?" "Natalie, Her dad didn't even bother to ask what was happening. He clearly knew. "You seemed so happy, and I didn't want to ruin it." "Well, that worked out great." Once again, everyone was staring at Natalie, but this time she really didn't care. She wanted everyone to see her father for the jerk that he was, but she realized now that she didn't actually want to see him herself. She didn't want to see him herself or look at him at all. She just wanted to get out of there. So she ran. Outside, the last minutes of sunset made the town more beautiful than ever, but she couldn't enjoy it. Tears stung her cheeks as she ran down Main Street, heading for the only place life still made sense, the only place where she knew she had friends she could count on. Sure enough, when she got to Perkins Cove, there they were. Banger, squeaking in the surf, and Lars, who must have made a beeline for the beach the moment Natalie had sent him off. The two friends were taking advantage of every last moment of sunlight to swim through the water, but when Banger saw Natalie, he barked a hello. She wiped the tears from her eyes as she made her way to them, kicking off her sandals, but neglecting to do anything else to her clothes. Right now, she didn't even care if her dress got wet. She just waded right on into the water. It was the warmest it had been all year. Her mother was right. Lars swam up to say hello, and his nuzzling nose was as comforting as usual. But as Banger came to join them, Natalie looked directly into one of his deep black eyes, and she knew something to be true. If Banger was ever going to be happy, if he was going to stay alive, he would have to go north and break up this friendship for good. And if he wouldn't do it, then she would have to do it for him. With one hand, Natalie reached out and pulled Lars close. With the other hand, she laid calmly on Banger's side as she leaned in and gently, lightly kissed him on the melon. And then she began to think of a plan. Chapter 14, Lars. This town meeting was even louder than the last, but there were a few things about it that made Lars excited to be there. For one thing, he'd snuck in to the courthouse while people were setting up, found the dreaded gavel, picked it up like it was a bone, and hidden it behind a tree outside the town hall where no one would be tempted to use it. For another thing, someone had hung a picture of him in the hall. He'd seen it on his way back in. He thought it was a very good picture of him, and he thought more public buildings should consider hanging up pictures of him, in general. But the most exciting thing of all was that Natalie was standing behind the judge's lectern, looking out at the people of Ogunquit, because Natalie had called this meeting herself. The night before, when Natalie had found him and Banger at the beach, she'd only stayed in the water for a little while, staring strangely at Lars and Banger before apparently coming to some sort of decision. Then she led Lars back to shore, put the leash on his neck, and ran with him to the Coveside Cafe, her dress still dripping wet. Mayor Maher was just leaving as they arrived, carrying a large canvas under his arm, and he stopped when he saw Natalie. Miss Prater, he said, I think I owe you an apology. It's been a week now, and rather than cause any problems, your porpoise friend seems to have brought us all together. And of course, your dog, too. He gave an obliging but curt nod down to Lars, who wagged his tail a few times for etiquette's sake. About that, Natalie said, will the courthouse be in use tomorrow morning? I think we need to call an emergency town meeting. The mayor frowned. No, it should be unoccupied, he said. But why do you want to? Great, thanks, bye. Natalie was already heading into the cafe, and Lars, bound by leash and loyalty, followed hot on her heels. Once inside, Natalie went from person to person spreading the news. Emergency town meeting, tomorrow morning, 10 a.m. at the courthouse. Be there. You had to hand it to the townspeople. Most would shy away from the prospect of two mysterious town-wide gatherings in 24 hours, but not the people of Ogunquit. Here they all were now, on a Saturday morning, packed right back into the courthouse, eager to see what crazy twist this tale would take next. Lars was pretty eager himself. He sat dutifully at Natalie's right-hand side, ready to lend any moral support she might need while she addressed the town. To Lars's right-hand side was Natalie's mother, holding hands with the infamous Diver Bob. On the other side of the lectern, to Natalie's left was Mr. Prater, dressed up in a shabby suit that, as far as Lars's nose was concerned, could have used a good dry cleaning. And finally, on the far left, thoroughly perplexed by how any of this had come to pass, was the mayor. All right, everyone, Natalie said, trying to get the room to quiet down. Mayor Maher had lent her a microphone, but her voice was still getting lost in the crowd. Where'd that gavel go? Can everyone please be... Lars barked as loud as he could, and the whole room fell into a stunned silence. Thank you, Lars, Natalie said, and thank you, everyone, for coming on such short notice. It has recently been brought to my attention that we have a problem on our hands, one that has to do with, of course, Banger. With what? Called out Barry Rosenberg, owner of Barnacle Berry's seafood restaurant. The porpoise, Natalie explained. So you agree he presents a problem? Mr. Reardon cried triumphantly. Lars let out a low growl, but Natalie scratched absent-mindedly behind his ears, and he fell quiet. This was her time to speak. With all due respect, Mr. Reardon, Natalie said, the problem isn't Banger himself. The problem is the environment he's in. He needs to be in a different one. As Natalie explained what her mother and Diver Bob had figured out together, Lars felt his heart sink, even as he was amazed by Natalie's courage. Banger was going to have to leave? For how long? Could he come back? As if reading Lars's mind, Natalie turned to the right. Tell him what you told me last night after the gallery. Dive, she paused. Bob. At that, Lars could smell the surprise on both of Natalie's parents. Diver Bob, for his part, seemed as implacably cheerful as he shuffled on up to the lectern. Thank you, Natalie, he said brightly before turning to address the room. It's true that harbor porpoises ought to live in waters well below 60 degrees, and once we hit tourist season, Ogunquit's water temperatures will exceed that on a regular basis. In water that warm, Banger risks overheating or getting sick, or possibly something much worse. The courtroom erupted in surprised whispers, but died down so Diver Bob could continue. When I heard that this porpoise had a tag on him from the Banger Sea Lab, I reached out to some of my marine biologist friends there, and they confirmed that the porpoise we call Banger is one they've been tracking since he was just a calf, a member of a normally sedentary pod historically located about 100 miles north of Ogunquit, where the water stays below 60 degrees year-round. We don't know how they got separated or where the pod is now, but we do know one thing. Once a harbor porpoise finds a place it likes to live, it often tends to stay there. So while we know where Banger came from, we can't be sure that he knows, or that he'll know enough to make an effort to return there, to his family. What does this have to do with any of us? Called out Mr. Grundy. For the answer to that question, Diver Bob said, I'd like to turn the floor over to Jim Prater. There was a murmuring in the crowd. Everyone in town knew about the tension between between Bob Dugnut and Jim Prater. But Mr. Prater was acting like a new man today. Lars had noticed the tension between Natalie and her father all week, ever since he tried to push Lars away on Sunday, and then oddly acted like it had never happened for the rest of the week. He'd seemed, more than anything, like a man running on guilt and nerves. But now, dressed up in what was quite possibly his nicest suit, Lars got the sense that Mr. Prater was doing his best to right anything he'd made wrong by doing his best for his daughter, even if it meant working together with the man he didn't get along with. Thank you, Bob, he said, stepping up to speak. And Natalie, who just last night had barely been able to look at her father, now squeezed his hand softly. Thank you, Dad. Hey guys, Mr. Prater said, waving awkwardly at the gang of fellow fishermen. It's been a crazy couple of weeks, for my daughter, for me, and for all of us here in Ogunquit. But before things go back to normal, one last crazy thing is going to happen. It's an idea Natalie came up with last night, and I'm very proud of it. But I'm here to personally speak to you upstanding citizens. Because for this crazy thing to happen, we're going to need some help, and we're going to need it from every last one of you. The entire front right of the room broke out in protests, questions, and scoffs. Mr. Prater stood back and waited for everyone to calm down, but even when they did, one person still had his hand up, Mr. Reardon, who was looking directly at Natalie. Yes? Natalie asked, calling on the man who was almost 40 years older than her. Why the change of heart? Mr. Reardon asked, skeptically. Just last week you were so eager to keep this dolphin. He paused. This harbor porpoise around. Health or safety be darned. Now you're practically leading the committee to drive it out of Dodge. Why should we believe you want our help in making it leave? Lars craned his neck up at Natalie, eager to hear her answer. He obviously trusted his human completely, but if she was going to send Banger away from Ogunquit, he hoped she had a really, really good reason. Natalie looked first to the left at her father and then to the right at her mother. Lars had never seen them all stand together like this. He wondered how long it had been since they'd been able to. And when Natalie turned back to the mic, she was almost smiling. Almost. She may as well have been. A genuine smile was one of those things Lars could just smell. It's not about the porpoise leaving, she explained. It's about helping it to go where it needs to be. She looked at her mother. Sometimes letting go of something isn't giving up. It's helping. Lars wasn't sure where those words had come from, but the moment Natalie said them, both her and her mother's sense turned into a rose gold wash of love and pride. Sitting there between them, taking it in, Lars felt like the luckiest dog in the world. Mr. Reardon grunted. Well, all right then, he said. I'm sorry to have interrupted. Please, tell us this plan of yours. All right, Natalie said, leaning forward, and she told them. And tomorrow night we will read Chapter 15, Natalie. Have a great night, and if you are listening to this on Wednesday, then I will see you tomorrow at school when you pick up your things. Sleep tight. Love you.